last week, we saw Microsoft build just an amazing set of announcements and honestly overwhelming in a number of ways. We saw that there are over 100 copilots. I think the number was over 130 that they announced. But more interesting than the number, perhaps, was that there's this transformation that is happening based on the copilots that are creating. I think you had pointed out as we were chatting before the show today that there's an interesting story on Strategery. I'm never quite sure how to say that, on how Copilot was actually starting to transform Microsoft and how Microsoft was finally starting to figure out how they are more than a Windows company. Of course, they've been making that transformation for a while, but I'm curious, what really got your attention there as you were looking at that and kind of the transformation of Microsoft?
Probably more than I can remember right now, but that was this article that you're referring to was fascinating to me. I think this gentleman does a brilliant job of just sort of analyzing the market and looking at everything. And Microsoft, for many of us, right, is a company that we wrote off a decade ago. That we were basically saying, hey, they had lost their way and they were no longer innovative and they missed the internet train and all of those things. And most of it was rooted in what this article points out. Was rooted in the fact that it was anchored to Windows, and everything revolved around Windows, and that the big thing that Satya did was break that apart, right? To drive this shift, and force this kind of transformation of where everything went. And so this article is actually talking about that one of the things that Microsoft announced actually before build was what they're calling the Copilot Plus PC. It's in a new standard, so they're releasing it in the form of the Surface, but they also have, I think it's 6 or 8 partners that are announcing this new PC, and it's got these very specific defined specs, and the idea is it's able to run local AI workloads, and it's going to speed things up and to be able to leverage it. But what was really interesting was that the point of this was that he found that Windows was now relevant again and interesting. And it wasn't because Windows was driving it, but it was the other way around. It was Azure and AI and the data elements that all now suddenly were driving innovation within the kind of the core of Microsoft. And so I think there's some really interesting lessons there about how to innovate for the enterprise. I think there's a lot of enterprises that probably look a lot like Microsoft did a decade ago, when it was, they're rooted in their historical underpinnings and their foundations, and they can't break free of it. He also tells the story of Walmart and their battle with Amazon, and how they used e-commerce to pivot around it. So, I mean, I highly encourage any CIO to read this article, to think mostly about the macro level, how to drive innovation within your organization and to sort of see through these lenses. So that was what that piece was, and I thought it was fascinating. They also made a lot of announcements. You talk about the 130 copilots. I think that's a problem for them, and I do think it speaks to some of the challenges with this entire space as it develops. But we can keep diving into all of that.
Yes, I think the 130 copilots is indicative of kind of the challenge that we're seeing around what we're now seeing is agentic AI, the idea that all these agents are going to be the interface between us and the actual AI at the end of the day. And we're trying to figure out how to prioritize which of these agents are most meaningful, which of these AIs are most meaningful, and how we're going to rationalize or consolidate, or even just understand which agents and which AIs are going to be used at which points. We're starting to finally define some of the use cases that are making AI meaningful around creating initial bases of code or some quick shortcuts to solve the empty screen problem and be able to start working, or to be able to create some templated documentation, especially when there's highly governed or highly detailed documentation that needs to be put into place, and being able to have that template that has been well defined, but perhaps has some nebulous or fuzzy aspects to it. Generative AI is actually really good at all of that stuff. And now we have these Copilot assistants to be able to help with that. But simply being able to access that without having to figure out which of the 80 or 130 or 250 or 8,000 co-pilots are going to finally exist in the long term is going to be an important piece of the puzzle. We're going to have to rationalize and simplify this story just a little bit to make it work.
Yeah, well, what I think is most interesting about it is that it's sort of, there, and I'm going to butcher this, so I'll do my best to paraphrase it so I don't butcher it too bad. But there's an old trope when it comes to automation: is that the first stage of automation is you automate what already exists, and the second stage is you start reimagining what
Yes.
those processes can look like when you have this technology to drive a change in the way you work. And right now, I feel like the copilots are sort of on that first stage, is that we're mostly thinking about copilots in terms of the way an organization works. Because if I think about it, it's like, okay, if I'm in a very large company, there easily are several hundred people that I might have to interact with to solve specific things. And so it's sort of the whole copilot mentality that we're having right now. It's like these are copilots designing to do very specific tasks. But that's mostly because a human has a very limited capacity to specialize in something. But that isn't how we want to function. It's an incredibly frustrating thing to try to figure out who the heck do I go talk to get this problem to solve. Well, why do I want to replicate that with my Copilot model? And I think that's the issue. So I'm a big believer in this idea of persona-based copilots to a point when it's if the point of it is a copilot designed for me, meaning if it's driven by me, if it's driven by the action I need to get done, right, the thing I need to execute on, then that's a problem. If I have to go figure out which copilot to use to achieve a specific activity, then that's the problem. And I think right now that's not clearly demarcated as far as which way this is going. And I think it's being exacerbated. One of the other things that that Microsoft announced was this sort of, I don't want to say a shift, but this evolution in posture to really saying, hey, now the next stage is enterprises need to be building their own copilots, right? We're giving you the building blocks. And this article from Verge was talking about how one of those use cases was, for instance, an IT support desk agent. Well, it's like, why am I going to go build that? That doesn't make any sense. It's like, let's go get something off the shelf that is designed to do that. That is a known function. And so I think you have this dilemma, this balance that we're trying to find of where does this really land? And I don't know the answer, but I know that right now, and it's not just Microsoft, right? ServiceNow has already a whole bunch of copilots, right? And we're seeing this all over the place. I don't think we've quite settled on what this process is going to look like yet. And right now, I think it's going to, because it's happening so fast, it's going to create a lot of confusion for an enterprise buyer trying to figure out, do I really need all these copilots? And if I've got a user that needs 6 of them, am I buying 6 separate copilot licenses? I mean, it's going to get crazy pretty quick.
Yes, but one of the things I find interesting about all this is a few years ago when Salesforce bought Slack, they talked about Slack becoming the OS for the enterprise. And back then, all of that sounded so pie in the sky, partially because Salesforce needed to build so much of a backend to make that a realistic vision. Now, fast forward a few years, and now we see that with this combination of copilots and Windows, Microsoft is actually starting to develop, actually deliver on this vision of kind of a text-based OS for the enterprise. And it ends up being a real thing. It's just that we needed another couple of steps of technology to make this happen. And this is part of why Satya Nadella is obviously all in on AI. And it seems like this next step, as you mentioned from that Verge article, is the need to actually automate tasks going forward and figure out which of these processes and which of these data schemas and which of these multiple applications and services and APIs really need to be available and can be automated and trusted to work on their own on all of these extremely detail specific and detail oriented tasks, but in a way that is trustable, because we have all these tasks in our lives that we are trying to complete from a business perspective that require extremely governed and compliant processes that honestly are not very intellectual in nature and are scut work. They're busy work. So hopefully being able to push that complexity off to the AI without losing quality is going to be a
Yeah.
big
So I mean, let's talk
improvement.
a little bit. You know, where do I think it where do I think this ends? And this is why I guess I'm not really bullish on the current approach taken, but it may be just the evolutionary process, right? But where does this end? Where this ends is that if I have a company with 1,000 knowledge workers, that what I actually have 1,000 co-pilots, but it's not that I have 1,000 co-pilots all doing different jobs. What I have is every individual knowledge worker has a co-pilot that is tuned to my specific job function, what it is that I'm doing, and it is able to help me with all of those things. And I think it ends up looking, you know, we've been talking a lot about agentic AI. We've talked about mixture of experts, which is not this. It's an underlying component, but I think it ends up feeling similar, right? In that what I end up with is a co-pilot is designed, like molded to my work, my job, so that it's able to help me with anything that I'm doing, and I don't have to think about it, right? And then behind the scenes, we've got these like underlying knowledge bases or models that we're leveraging then to do that. And right now, that's not how this is coming out, and it's I think it's flipped upside down at the moment. But I think we're going to get there. I think it's just a matter of what is that, you know, how does that end up evolving?